Today we're going to teach you how to make, haft, and use your very own big game hunting points. Hey guys, Ryan Gill here with Hunt Primitive, where we entertain, educate, and inspire. And on this channel we typically do primitive build or hunting videos just like this one. So if it's your first time to the channel, do please consider subscribing. And I get a tremendous amount of questions from people asking me what size, how to haft, what's the difference between stone and steel, the different types of stones, about any sort of questions that you could possibly ask. I've been asked, and this video is going to cover 99% of them right now. Alright, well, let's get on to the making of some of the points, but let's also talk about the different flake sizes and materials that we are going to run into with making our own hunting points. They're going to have two major differences that a lot of people ask, and that is stuff like flints and cherts and obsidian. Flints and cherts really are going to absorb all other types of jaspers, agates, cherts, just various materials from around the United States, quite honestly around the world. And then we start getting into stuff like the volcanic glass, which is obsidian. So when you hear me talk about chert or flint, as I just kind of use that word interchangeably, I'm really referring to all manner of chalcedony, chert, jasper, agate, what have you. And then obsidian is going to be obviously any of the volcanic classes of the different types of obsidian or dacite. Whatever you choose at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter a whole lot. Obsidian is without a doubt sharper, but it is also more brittle. And then likewise, the opposite of that is the chert is not quite as sharp, although it is very, very sharp and can kill anything on the planet without any issue, but it is a little bit more robust. So the big question that everybody seems to want to ask all the time is, what is better, cherts, flints, or obsidian? And the answer, truthfully, is neither. Neither is better. At the end of the day, this stuff is going to kill deer or any other big game animal just as dead as the other one. So really just don't overthink it too much. Use whatever you like or what is native to your area, because even though this is a little bit sharper and more brittle, and this is a little bit more robust but a little less sharp, the end result is not going to be noticeable. When you run this through the lungs of an animal, it's not a big deal. Expect that an obsidian point is more likely to break during the shot or after the shot, but that doesn't mean the chert doesn't break either, because it does. But there is neither one of these, as another misconception that we hear of quite often is, well, you can't shoot something with an obsidian point, it'll just blow up on impact, and that's not the case at all. Even if you hit a rib or even a relatively robust bone, yes, it may break, but the momentum of that arrow is traveling, and it's already inside the body, and if it is going to get any sort of penetration anyway, all the new edges that are now created from that broken obsidian point are just lacerating things as it goes. So I've never just shot an animal with an obsidian point and the arrow goes and blows up and then you don't get the arrow or the animal. It doesn't really work like that, okay? So you can use either one of these. I've shot animals, several animals, with both. I've spine shot and killed animals with obsidian points, and chert points the same, and quite honestly, they all just kill animals just as dead. So hopefully that little issue is now behind us. So choose whichever one you want and let's go from there. Alright, and now we'll just talk really briefly on the size of the flakes that you're going to be working with. So something like this one here is what I typically gravitate towards when I want to make a hunting point, but that's also because it's closer to the dimensions that the finished point that I'm wanting to make is going to be, but also after all the many years that I've spent flint knapping, I also know that I'm going to have a lot fewer mistakes, and I can take a little piece like this, trim off the excess, thin it massively in just a few hits, and be into a hunting point. So I would say with experience, something like this size is actually perfect. Where when you're a little bit fresh at flint knapping and you're just kind of learning, a larger flake like this is going to give you a little bit more room for error. So you can work on your thinning process, make some mistakes, thin it some more, so something like this is not a bad choice. So if you're just getting started, be shooting for some of these larger flakes. So as we get into actually making a point from this flake, We're not going to go through the entire process of making the point. We're going to give you a couple highlighted segments throughout the build, but there is another really good video that will walk you through the entire flint knapping process, and if you've been following my channel for really any amount of time, you are already very familiar with that video, and that is flint knapping for beginners. And I will drop the picture of it up on the screen so you can see that, but then I'll put a link down in the description. So if you're learning to flint knap, watch that video. That will really teach you how to make an arrowhead. Whereas this video is focusing on more what you need to be able to create a good hunting point. There's also another video that I'm going to go ahead and throw up here as well, and I'll drop that link, and it's kind of like the sequel to that one. I've got several really good flint knapping videos, but that one is how to thin points, because what you're going to run into is a lot of these thicker pieces, and you're going to take a lot of flakes off the edges, and you're going to have a hard time getting it thin. That video specifically talks on how to thin pieces. So if you watch the first video and you start making points but they're thicker than you want, watch that second video. Make sure that you save this video or save those videos somewhere, write them down so you can go back and watch them, because my goal is to get you from A to Z on making your own stone hunting points as quick and painless as possible, and that is what those points are for. And then this one, of course, is to say these are the dimensions you want to shoot for, this is how to haft it, this is how to apply it. Keep in mind also that this video uses modern tools. I have a tremendous amount of other videos on the YouTube channel that teach you how to use indigenous tools, and those videos are typically a lot longer and more drawn out, complex videos. So the purpose of this video really is to just get you to A to Z as soon as possible. You can substitute modern tools for the early indigenous tools to just accomplish the same tasks. So if you'd like to see just the indigenous tool builds, absolutely check out some of the other videos on my Hunt Primitive YouTube channel that specifically dive really deep into Stone Age tools and usage. We'll braid the little junk off and just start running some thinning flakes quick. I'm already shooting for this is going to be my point and this will be the base, and just because it's already getting more narrow that way, so I can maximize my time investment on it. Okay, so this is the percussion flint knapping. Like I said, the Hunt Primitive Flint Knapping for Beginners video is really one that you're going to want to watch if you're not a little bit seasoned with flint knapping. But there's a couple things just to kind of show you through this process that I may have missed, and so I just want to make sure that I cover those in this video. But we won't keep you here real long on this portion of the video. Okay. See how I'm setting up platforms to across the back so I can drive these bigger thinning flakes. Go. It's a good one. So now we're already just that fast. I mean, that was really just a few seconds. You didn't all miss a whole lot there. We've already really thinned the base out. That's kind of a nice little preform to start with. We got a little bit more to remove here, but not a tremendous amount. Knock that cortex off. That's the best part too about like this Georgetown, is the cortex is so thin that it's not hard to knock off. It'll run a flake right under that cortex with very little effort. So we're gonna walk that down, and that's again, that's Georgetown chert. We also like on the website, Hunt Primitive website, for a while it was a premium Edwards because it's a type of Edwards chert. But we had lots of other types of Edwards cherts as well, but primarily right now this is the best of the best. It's the Georgetown, and we've got quite a bit of it. So if you're wondering what that is, that's what it is. And of course, just like I even say in the other videos, if you need rock or tools or anything like that, you can get all that stuff at huntprimitive.com. You can get it some other places too, and if you find something you like better somewhere else, go ahead and pick that up. The end goal really is just to get you flint knapping and enjoying the process. And you know, at the end of the day too, we even sell the arrow points, but I'm not going to lie, there's so much work that goes into arrow points, and it's very hard for me to keep up with everyone's orders. I even have folks that are making preforms for me to help me keep up, and then I can finish the preform. So they'll get them a little bit smaller and more triangular than this, and then they mail in or even drive them here, like many at a time. So we can try to keep up with everybody's orders. So I'm not that worried about selling hunting points per se, but it is such an instrumental part of Hunt Primitive and what we do that of course I'm always going to offer them. But more importantly, I would really rather teach you to make your own, because that is the best part about primitive archery, is that you're striving to make all of this stuff yourself, whether it's bows and arrows or stone points. But see, all this stuff is progressional. It's very hard to just pick it all up and make it all and learn how to make it all in a very short amount of time. So a lot of times folks get into either flint knapping first or bow making first. And sometimes it can be hard to juggle multiple interests at one time. And so what we do at Hunt Primitive is we kind of offer the opportunity to say, well, if you're getting into bow building or whatever, but you want to shoot stone points, then you can either, you know, get arrows from us while you're learning that process or get stone points. But ultimately, the goal is to teach you how to make this stuff yourself, because unlike modern archery stuff, you don't really ever learn how to make the things that you buy to hunt with. That's one of the most amazing things about primitive archery, is you can learn over a period of time to make all this stuff. Even with traditional archery, it turns into some of the more manufacturing sides. Like, you don't normally make your own broadheads, but in primitive archery you can. But it doesn't mean that you have to start from scratch and learn all of it, and that's where Hunt Primitive kind of comes into it, to say, learn it at your pace. If you want to buy stuff from us to get you over the hump, that's what Hunt Primitive is all about. But at the end of the day, I'd much rather teach you how to make your own points, because that's where the real satisfaction of primitive archery and primitive hunting really is. And I think I've made that pretty apparent throughout my YouTube videos and website, that we really focus on, you know, the entertain, educate, and inspire. And that really comes at the fact that I want you guys to be able to do this stuff yourself. We're just here if you need a hand along the way. Or maybe there's folks that are like, nope, I just don't have time to make my own stone points, but I want to hunt with stone points. That's perfectly fine too. There's no shame in that. You know, early people, without a doubt, didn't always make all of their own stuff. They would have traded for things that, you know, maybe they weren't as good at making. And while some of them probably did make all of their own hunting things, there's, I'm sure, some guy that was probably really good at just making arrows, and he just made arrows for the village, and somebody else that was really good at making arrowheads, and that's what he did, and somebody that was really good at making bows, and if you weren't good at one of them, you went and picked that up from him and traded him out. So that's basically what we're kind of doing today. So you can see we're really down here to that preform now. And we're going to move on to indirect percussion, and you're going to want to see what I'm doing here, because I have a couple mentions about the indirect percussion. And if you haven't got into this stuff, it is a serious game changer. People that really spend just a very short amount of time learning how to do the indirect percussion typically end up very happy with the results. All right, so again, shoving this, and I use an old ammo can just because it's easy here in the shop, but any little stool or a stump or whatnot that you want to put your leg up on, and then grab this with your underneath your knee, that's how we're going to hold that in place. And you've probably seen me do the indirect percussion before, and I want to show you that here, where it's lining up the platform that you want to strike off, holding it, putting a little bit of up tension, and then driving it off. You couldn't see that whole flake come off, but that piece came off, but you can see it ran all the way over to there. So that's pretty far. That's a good flake. Now, I've shown you that before. This is a real game changer, especially with the copper tools. Even more so with the Aboriginal or Indigenous tools using either one like this, which is kind of the same theme but with the moose antler tip, or using a larger tine and just holding the antler tine like this and using it, but then also using the larger billet end like this. Okay, this is really important stuff moving forward, and we're going to do another video for sure where we talk a lot about the indigenous knapping. You know I love to do that stuff on my channel, but I know that this is where most of you guys are going to live with your builds, at least for now. So this would be this end, and then this end, which is the copper, is basically taking the point of this end. And I don't talk about this a tremendous amount, but I have previously. But the important thing is, on a piece that's this size, we're already to the point that we're just using the small copper bit to remove it. But what I'm also seeing from people, and I've not been very good at explaining it, is when you're working with some of these larger pieces, that I have been seeing people putting like this here and trying to drive it off, and while it's working, they're getting some long flakes. They're very thin and they might be long, but they're not taking a lot of material off. But not only that, if they're not getting the results they want, human nature is just hit it harder, keep hitting it, and the next thing you know, you're bending the tip up on it, and then you're bending it back, and you do that only so many times and it's going to break off. Okay, so it's a big interesting point. That's what this is for. I had mentioned that in another video, and that's why having an indirect percussion stick that's got the copper on the back on the bigger piece is so important. Now there's also, I had mentioned doing it like this where you leave a little bit of space, and this is kind of a bounce back, and you can drive flakes like that over a period of time. While I still like that, freehanding it is really nice, leaving a space so you still get the hit and you'll drive some flakes. And now even more so as I get closer, give me a second here to get there. See, I can batter the edge with it, but even more so, as opposed to free floating it, use this as the same way that you would use the piece on the backside, the little bit, and you're not going to bend or break your little bit by doing that. Pick this up, use this end, and you can drive some really significant flakes off with that. And of course they go flying pretty far, but things know if you can see that flake that's running across here. So I just wanted to make mention of that. That's why these are really a lifesaver when it comes to flint knapping. And then too, you're not putting these right up against the tip like you do the little bit. You gotta angle these up a little bit higher on the platform, and then you can drive really nice flakes almost all the way across. And so that way, if you're not super good at the percussion, you can switch to the indirect percussion and actually line out exactly where you want to hit, hold it right there, and then go ahead and whack it with the mallet, or the mallet. Alright, so now we're skipping ahead. We've got it preformed out right into basically our arrowhead preform, which now is thin and it's the correct dimensions, and we'll talk about dimensions here in a few minutes. And then it comes to notching and sharpening, and we're ready to roll. Alright, so now this, I'm going to set this down so I don't break it. This is another spot where we want to talk about the modern tools again, and there's two different tools that we sell in some of the different kits, and you'll notice we talk about this in other videos too, which I call a notching flaker, which is basically a copper flaker that's hammered flat, and we use that to notch. And then there's the micro flaker. So there's great purposes for both of these. Once you get to a real point in your flint knapping, you actually will no longer need the notching flaker, but it's very important, so don't get rid of it yet, and actually don't get rid of it ever, because it does have another use as well that I'm going to teach you in just a few minutes. Once you get to where you're making very thin preforms, then like this one, the notching or the micro flaker is all you really need. You don't need this one anymore. But why this one is so important, especially for getting started, is if you're working with larger preforms and you need to notch, this gives you not only more surface area, and the ability to rock through it, but it's a lot stronger. So you can, if you're working a thicker preform and you're not really good at thinning yet, that's why this is so important, because if you take that micro flaker and you push really hard and try to break flakes off with it, guess what's going to happen? I saved one here just to show you. You know what happens when you do that? That's what happens. You bend the dang thing. Now, if you over abuse this, you're going to break it. It's not for, or you're going to bend it. It's not for doing mass material removal. It's for very fine edge work. But this one can take some major abuse without bending. And until you learn to get your preforms really, really thin, you're going to want to continue to use this. Now, once you've got to the point where you're making really thin preforms and you no longer need the notching tool for the notching tool, and maybe you need to bail yourself out once in a while, if you have a, there's not really one on this one to show you, but if you have a step fracture, and if you know what a step fracture is, or a hinge where it comes in and it kind of stops, there's a little trick to that where if you put the step fracture on the bottom, okay, take this flat bar, this copper, and then you reach under to that, you know, this one again doesn't have one, but reach under to where that hinge would be, kind of grab onto it and then rock the point down. We'll pretend like this one has one. There's a tiny one here, but not enough to even really worry about trying to grab. So you see how it actually coming right in from the side. I can hook that copper, because copper grabs really, really well. That's why copper is important rather than steel. And then you can rock these together and it'll pop that little hinge off for you. So save that tool. It's a great little tip for what that is. It's a multi-purpose tool, and you can use the micro flaker for that too, as long as it's very small ones. They're not fragile, but you'll know when you push too hard that you will be able to bend it. You can put some stress on it, just not like you can the copper. Now, another question that I've gotten many times about this is people say, well, can I just use a flathead screwdriver instead? The answer is yes, you can absolutely use it. But a screwdriver is made out of steel, which is significantly harder than copper. And hard steel is going to skate off that rock a lot easier than copper, which is going to grab, bite, and remove that flake. So yes, you can take a screwdriver and just kind of rudimentary push down and remove some flakes, but what you're doing on the inside of that notch is you're just kind of blunting the notch, and it's going to make it very difficult to continue flake removal, where if you use something like this and you're removing flakes, you're actually driving flakes as opposed to just crushing them down. So can you use a flathead screwdriver? Well, sure, but you're not going to get the same results out of that you would by using copper. Alright, so now once you're to the point where you're going to use one of these tools to make your notches, we're going to do a side notch point here. And where you put the notches, it's kind of up to you. We're just going to give you a couple little hints along the way. And if you've watched my notching video that I've got, where a notching and sharpening video, which is a really, really good video to teach you just about notching and sharpening. I talk about doing a very small E-notch. You'll have to watch that video to kind of figure it out. And if I remember, I'll drop that one down in the description as well. And that's how you're going to be able to run really nice flakes to notch your arrowhead. Alright, there the arrowhead is notched. Now we're just going to sharpen it. Yeah, I'll make sure to drop that link down in the description on the notching and sharpening portion of this, because that's again a whole new video just on its own. And when you're to that point, we got some great tips in there. And I can sharpen one out here pretty darn quick. In fact, I'm going to kind of do it in real time. But that's also, remember, I've done at this point thousands of these. So I'm a lot faster than you. You shouldn't strive to be this fast at this point in the game, okay? You need to take your time, really look at what your what flakes you're removing. The only reason I can go fast, like I said, is I've got a tremendous amount of experience in sharpening these points. So I can put my tool right where it needs to be and actually feel the difference in the flake as I'm removing it, and I know to give more pressure or less pressure. And once I kind of feel that edge, I go in, make a couple slight adjustments. Yep, and we start getting her pretty darn sharp. Go ahead and do the other side. And then I'm going to show you a couple things you need to watch out for on your points. And then we're also going to talk about the dimensions of the points, which are exceptionally important to your success. Yep, that's good and sharp. I like that. Maybe one more little spot right there. Could dress that up. A couple little harder flakes. Oh yeah, that's gnarly. That's good right there. That side's good. Maybe one more right there. Right there. Oh yeah, that's gnarly right there. So now the trailing edges are going to be your most important for your sharpness. I'm not saying that it doesn't need to be sharp up here, and it kind of does, but the ones that should feel just insanely sharp on the back of your thumb are the ones that are up here, because that's what's going to do the majority of your laceration. And you still want them sharp up here, but you don't want these big serrations. I've talked about that before. You don't want these great big serrations up by the tip, because they'll hinder your penetration. So smaller serrations, almost getting down to where you're crushing the edge right at the tip with the side of the flaker. So instead of coming at it like this, you're actually going to be coming at it more like this, using the side of it, and you're just going to be like brushing to almost crush that edge on the tip. And this is a really, really, really important part that I need you to make sure that you guys see. Is I want you to see how sharp that tip is. It's exceptionally sharp, and if I push it on me right here, it's fine, it'll push my skin in a little bit, but you can feel, if I push very hard, it's gonna pop right in like a needle. And that's what you want. You need that to get optimal penetration. But notice as we look along this edge that there's no great big serrations, and it's not rounded. Okay, very important. Look at the tip geometry of this point. You can see it's very triangular. It is not rounded. It is not bull-nosed. And I can tell you from a phenomenal amount of experience and testing that this very steep triangular tip geometry is incredibly beneficial to penetration, as opposed to having points that have a rounded front to them. Please, please do not round the front of your points, because they are literally slowing down your penetration, and I have seen points bounce off of deer. Okay, so now look again how we get thinner and thinner and thinner. That's a really nice uniform point overall. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the point itself. Alright, so we talked about the tip geometry of it. Very, very important. Dimensions for proper deer hunting size points. And I shouldn't even really say deer hunting. This is really all game, okay? A tremendous amount of information in my book, and I'm going to tell you about that even in 1 second. But everything from deer on up to bison, this point right here is really a killing machine. This is what you want to strive for when you're making, okay? Relatively thick, between an 1/8 inch and 3/16 thick, okay? And then dimensions this way. On the back side, you want between 7/8 and 1 inch. Now, we did a tremendous amount of testing, and they're actually right here behind me. Grab that. I mean, these are pages. Look how many pages are there, okay? That's pages and pages and pages of hogs and deer, but specifically hogs that both myself and my really good friend Vaston Hall shot with stone projectiles, all the way down to teeny tiny little 12 grain points on up to points that were even around 100 or even more. And you can see a massive difference in penetration on the really heavy points. The really big points just do not penetrate a lot. Now, I've got all of those sheets that I just showed you. They're in this book. So there's like 20 some of these pages in the book, the same exact ones there, that you can actually look at the penetrative data, and if we recovered the animal or if we didn't, the poundage of the bow, the speed that the bow shot a specific grain arrow. A tremendous amount of data is in that. And when I tell you about the dimensions on the side of the point, the size of the points that we're shooting, it comes from a book that has so much data in it that I've killed over 50 animals with primitive hunting implements, and then not just me, but guys like Vaston Hall, who I've given this kind of stuff to and said, here, go shoot stuff with it. He's killed a tremendous amount. And then on top of that, even customers as well that are really every single year consistently taking down big game animals using this stuff, and we've got a tremendous amount of data in this book. It's The Secrets and Science of Primitive Archery, and it has very little to do with book sales. Very little. In fact, I kept it black and white even. It's black and white pictures in here. That's actually, funny, I opened it to that page. That talks about the transitions, which I'm going to talk to you about here in just a minute. It's just so funny, I opened right up to that picture. But we keep them black and white, but you can still see what's going on because we want to keep the price of the book down. I don't care about the book sales. I care that you guys have all the information to have the best information in your hands so you can be as successful as possible. And because of that, that's why I'm going to tell you about the point size and what you really need to be shooting, and that there's a huge difference between primitive archery and traditional archery. So when we talk about traditional archery, which is more stuff like fiberglass laminate bows, either carbon or wood shafted arrows, and then steel broadheads, that's what we really refer to as traditional archery. And some really interesting data and really good information overall are, say, like the Dr. Ashby reports, which many people are very, very familiar with, and that is exceptionally good information for traditional archery using a high FOC front of center and high mass arrows. The heavier the arrow, the better the penetration, and all that kind of plays together and is a great piece of work and a good standard to go by when you shoot with traditional archery gear. When you transition into the primitive side of things and you're shooting stone projectiles, it's a totally different game, because what's not listed in the Dr. Ashby's reports, because it was never meant to be for stone projectiles and primitive archery and contextual strings and all that stuff, is the kinetic friction. Because the kinetic friction of steel points is actually really, really low. So you can have manufactured steel points with the nice smooth ferrules, and the kinetic friction is kind of a stable variable within the set where they're all going to be exactly the same, and they're optimized and manufactured to be as such. But when you start making stone projectiles that really, they can't just be honed like steel, they must be chipped to be sharpened, and then also the way that they're hafted into the shaft leaves a lot of room for variation and also error, to where you are increasing the kinetic friction of the point and the shaft, which drastically hinders penetration. So what that all really means, and while it is really well explained in the book over many chapters, we need to approach stone projectiles differently than we do steel projectiles because of the significant increase of the kinetic friction. So yes, while greater mass and momentum and kinetic energy promote penetration, increased kinetic friction decreases penetration. So what we've actually found through a lot of our not only testing for the book, doing the actual test in the book, but actually putting it into practical application and shooting live animals, is the very large stone points, as opposed to getting larger. The larger the stone point, the greater the kinetic friction, and it compounds that much faster, where you're not compounding kinetic friction on large steel points that are very sleek, thin, and smooth. You're not compounding kinetic friction at the same rate that you are compounding kinetic friction with stone projectiles. And when you increase the weight and the size of stone projectiles, the compounding of kinetic friction is greater than the benefits seen from the increased kinetic energy. So again, what that all really means is when you want to start shooting larger animals, you actually need to start shooting smaller stone projectiles. Very smooth transitions, and also very tapered, sleek shafts that we'll actually talk about in a few minutes as well. So all that being said, and I hope that you absorbed it, and if you didn't, please feel free to go back and rewind it quite a bit, or again, get the book, because this is phenomenal information that you really need to know about being as successful as you can possibly be. Okay, so all that being said, the best dimensions for stone projectiles that you can possibly shoot for penetration, laceration, and taking down large game animals is as follows. Yes, some smaller points will penetrate further, but when we really consider the laceration of the wound channel mixed with the performance of primitive bows, what I have found, and you can see this throughout the book, is the width of it being between 7/8 and 1 inch, not greater than 1 inch, and the length being about, roughly, give or take a little bit here, 1 3/4 inches, 2 inches at the max. 1.5 inches is getting short. However, 1.5 inches is fine if you just decrease the overall size of the point. So you can actually shoot a point and get great performance out of it by taking it right where those notches are, getting rid of that, and just shooting this. You can notch that. So that would be about a 40 grain point, and that'll kill animals really, really dead as well and do just fine. Or you can shoot one that's slightly larger like this. And one like this, we're looking at about 65 to 70 grains, and that's going to be about your ideal weight and size. So 7/8 to 1 inch wide, really no wider than 1 inch, and about 1 3/4 inches long, and that is about the deadliest point that you can shoot on contextual primitive archery implements. And again, that will do massive, massive damage on everything from deer to bison, and I've always said in my other videos, from bunnies to bison, but this is ridiculous to shoot at a rabbit. Just shoot blunts at rabbits and squirrels. You don't need to shoot stone projectiles. Alright, excellent. Now with all of that being talked about, very, very important information, let's skip over to actually hafting this point onto an arrow and how to do that very efficiently for penetration, and then we'll be able to get you on your way to completing all your own primitive hunting goals. Now in the process of hafting, I'm going to show you that on actually an atlatl foreshaft, so it's going to be a little bit bigger, more robust, and use a larger point than an arrow, but the hafting is pretty much going to be about the same, so it's perfect. I can maneuver around so I can teach you a little bit better. Of course, you just want to make sure that you've got a notch cut in, however you want to cut it in, saw blades, whittle it out with a rock, whatever you want to do, and you want to make sure that the point fits pretty tight the way it is. If you shake it and it falls out and breaks on the floor, then I recommend making it a little bit tighter next time. Then I also want to be able to show you that this seats all the way at the bottom, so it doesn't have any daylight under it. Okay, you can see under it now. Now if your point doesn't seat all the way to the bottom and you pitch glue this in, if it hits something relatively hard like a rib bone, what it can do is start that chain reaction of now it's going to push the point back, which is going to break the pitch loose and rob energy from the penetration of your point and your arrow. And potentially once the point is broke loose, it could start rocking off to the side or completely out. So we want to make sure that when we cut our notch and fit our point, that it's tight and it seats all the way against the bottom. Now on this one, if we just haft it like this, this is a test that when people come and we look over their stuff, I always say put your fingers up like this, loosely together, and slide the point between your fingers. If you can close your eyes on a finished arrow and you can push and you can feel that transition and it stops you, that's also going to stop penetration. So let me show you that on an arrow here, and then I'll explain the arrow a little bit better. So this is a completed arrow. It's one of my hunting arrows. So I can slide this freely with no hang up. Now there's a slight amount of resistance in here because of the Sinew wrappings, and we'll get to that point in a few minutes, but overall it's pretty slick and smooth, and there's actually going to be more resistance on these serrations than there is going to be on the transition. So this right here, if you can slide it through, close your eyes and not feel any abrupt stops, then that's what you're going to be looking for. So then before we go ahead and pitch glue this in, what we'll do now is, now that it's dry fit, we'll take it back out, and then we just want to be able to trim and round off this whole transition area. Not perfectly at this point, but really just get rid of some of these heavy shoulders. And you can do that just by whittling it here with a knife and whittling it down. You can throw it on a sander if you have one, or you can scrape it and grind it down on a rock like you've seen me do, oh, however many times before if you've been watching my channel. So there you go. You can see that that's a little bit smoother. It's not perfect yet. We're going to be able to pitch glue this in, also putty, and then even trim these edges a little bit more. Now, there's a really important thing to discuss right here, because this being an Atlatl Spear 4 shaft, we're not going to really taper this out thin, and that's because the oscillation, which is the flex of the shaft during flight, is pretty substantial in an Atlatl thrown spear shaft, and so we need to try to keep this a little bit more robust, so we're not doing a real heavy taper. But the weight of these projectiles is so great that we're not going to have to worry about needing all that extra tapering and loss of kinetic friction to penetrate the animal. But now with an arrow that does not carry as much weight and therefore momentum and kinetic energy, we need to decrease the kinetic friction by tapering the arrow all the way down to the point. So you'll notice that here in the mid arrow, it's significantly thicker than it is as it starts getting down to the tip. So we start about back to here and just start slowly tapering this, and this is why we fill the end of the arrow with another piece of cane. So this is another great visual for you. Let's just pretend that this piece of cane is the end of our arrow shaft that has nothing in it. It's just the hollow internodal chamber. Then we're going to take another thinner round piece of cane and we glue it into here. Now this one's a little bit loose because I want to show you, but what I want is a really nice friction fit that I don't have to force in there, but it really seats in there good and tight. This one gets close right at the end, but then we can glue this in either with a wood glue, or in more early primitive times we use a hide glue. But it's very important that when you glue this that it is very tight, because you don't want any of those gaps. You want a nice secure fit all the way down into the bottom until it stops. Let this dry, and then what this has done, it has stiffened these walls. If you taper these things down and make them paper thin, but you've not plugged and filled the end, they'll just simply snap really, really easily. But by adding that other piece of round cane down on the inside and gluing that in, we just made essentially an arrow shaft within the arrow shaft that when we taper this down, it's still very strong, because even this thin piece of cane is extremely strong, because you can see how what it takes to break that, a fairly significant amount. So imagine that on the inside of this arrow shaft is going to stiffen it up quite a bit. Now in a previous video you've seen where I actually take skewers like this, and I've taken the skewers and I've packed them in there, and that works too, but you have to make sure that all the voids are filled and that you're getting a really good tight fit with everything. However, I much now prefer to do the solid cane plug inside of the hollow internodal chamber. So hopefully now that gives you a better understanding of how we're able to take it thicker here and really taper this down to where it's got very little kinetic friction. And as soon as we hit the animal, it'll just slide right through. And a ton more information and tests on that are also in my book, The Secrets and Science of Primitive Archery. Alright, now that we've got the haft fit and tapered in a little bit, we can go ahead and use any sort of heat source. I typically use a propane torch when I'm in the shop. And we're going to take our pine pitch glue. Actually, first thing first is I'm going to heat that up. I don't want to burn it a whole lot, but it does kind of burn up all the little tail edge pieces, which is fine. But it also just heats that cane, because we don't want to cold shock the pitch when it hits. Hot pitch hitting cold cane won't stick very well. So this kind of helps it absorb down into the cane and really make a nice adhesion line. So we'll put some in there. Same thing here, we're going to heat up the back of the point, not a tremendous amount. And you can be fairly liberal with the glue, it's not a big deal. And slide it together. Make sure that it's okay to have a lot of excess on it. You want to spin it and make sure it spins true. Look down at if it doesn't spin real good one way but it did the other. Flip it over, look at it a couple times. You gotta a good several seconds before this stuff starts to harden up. And it's not a big deal if it does, because you can just stick it back over the flame. So that's spinning pretty darn true. Looks pretty good. It's seated all the way in the bottom. Then I'm going to lick my finger. Okay, and I'm going to start pushing the pitch up. I lick my finger so it doesn't stick to my finger. If you touch this stuff without licking your finger, it'll just all stick to your finger. And what I'm doing is I'm using this stuff like a putty to just fill in every single gap and in front of the cane transition, or the transition onto the arrow shaft. Okay, now that it's fit all the way, I lick my other fingers, and I really kind of want to compact it and just make sure that I'm forcing all of that glue in that whole transition. Kind of get it out of the notches a little bit. It doesn't have to be perfectly clean. Check your spin, which a lot of times when you're making these adjustments, it's not lined up perfectly. That one's lined up pretty nice. That looks pretty good. Okay, so now we just let this cool down for, oh, I don't know, 10-15 minutes. You'll know when this stuff stops being tacky, it's ready to work. With this cooled down, we're just going to go ahead and trim up the little edges again. This one's a little bit more robust than the arrow, but we still don't want to have any major hang-ups in here. So we can thin these down pretty good with a blade of some sort. Then we can take our sinew, and I don't do anything with it other than just peel it apart, and then you'll notice that your deer back sinew, you can use your fingernail and just pull off these long threads. Then you can soak it, or more preferably to me, I like to chew it. It really softens it up, activates those glues. I'll do this kind of in reverse for you for how I do it, but it'll look the same. Essentially, I just take my thumb, pinch it underneath the notches, and then I'm going to go through the notch straight across, and basically all I'm doing is figure eighting around this one good time, and I'm pulling it fairly tight. Okay, and then finish that off, and then these need to be very neat side by side wraps. And then you can just rotate, and I like to do just a little bit more. That's actually about enough, especially for an arrow. It doesn't hurt to have a little bit more, but you want relatively thin strands of sinew, and then to add a new one in, we'll just catch right where we left off and wrap that in. But it's really important. This is a spot, again, that I see a lot of people make a big mistake, is they just wind this stuff everywhere, and they mound it up great big, and you just made another friction point for when it's going through the animal, and you don't want that. So see, it goes back here, you know, 3/4 of an inch or an inch or so, and then we can just let that dry. And to really kind of seal it down, you can either use hide glue, which is great. You can even use some pitch glue, but you got to be careful doing that, because the heat from that will shrink up like and crinkle and curl your sinew, so you don't want that to happen. So you just got to do it at a lower temp, or use hide glue, which is great. For customer stuff, I use the Type 3 because it's more water resistant. It's just one less thing for them to have to worry about, but all it's doing is kind of locking that sinew in, but it'll shrink and really squeeze that point in there as it dries all on its own, because that sinew naturally shrinks. So when people ask about using the artificial sinew, the issue, and I know that you can use it and super glue it down and it can work, but the two things are not equal. And the reason is this is like wax coated nylon, and number one, it doesn't shrink, and then also it's wax coated so the glue doesn't stick to it. But then I often do see, and we'll use this as an example, we'll use my arrowhead here that's actually finished, and while we're doing that, I'll go ahead and show you. You can see how thin the sinew is on here, and that way it doesn't disrupt our penetration. Look how smooth this is. This is extremely, extremely important stuff when it comes to penetration, especially for contextual primitive archery. So just that one thin wrapping of sinew is fine. And so not only do I typically not see people tapering their shafts in, which is a mistake, but then they'll take artificial sinew and then they go like this. and I've seen this a million times, and you're really counting against yourself, but I've literally seen this more times than I can count, and I wish that people would understand how detrimental it is to their penetration. So look at the difference in that. Now you can see all that stuff that's wound up. You can close your eyes and push, but you can feel it stopping right there, and it's just mounded up. You don't need all of that. So try to stay away from the artificial sinew, even if you're doing more modern builds. And you can split this stuff down, obviously, and make it much thinner, or use the lighter stuff. But again, it doesn't shrink, and it's wax coated, so it doesn't the glue doesn't stick to it as well. Can you use it? Yes. When I was much younger and early on in this, I used it, and you know, kind of used the lighter to melt some of the wax and stuff off, and glued it down and killed deer with it. Yes, it works, but far ahead, better choices are using real sinew, and of course the pine pitch glue, and then just a little bit of the wood glue or hide glue. So hopefully that's kind of got all your questions answered in regards to making, hafting, and using your own stone hunting points. Alright guys, thanks for following along, and hopefully we've been able to teach you just about everything that you would need to know to make, haft, and potentially even use your very own big game hunting points. We got some other great videos linked down in the description that we've highlighted through these videos, so very, very good stuff to watch. Also, consider checking out my book, The Secrets and Science of Primitive Archery. There's so much good information in there that's going to help you get you where you want to be in your own primitive archery adventures.